purpose of the interview series is just to give you an opportunity to tell your story, share your experiences, and to show that Louisiana is a place of problem solvers and diversity, and not just the problem to be solved. It's very informal, but it's designed to give not only Louisiana, but the rest of the world a snapshot of the people who are doing amazing work in this community and are just connecting Louisiana to the rest of the world. I always ask very complicated, very complex, multi-layered questions, but when I start an interview, it's never with a question like that. The question I always start with is pretty simple, and that is, where are you from? Where are you coming from?
I'm here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana right now, but I was born in Maringouin, which is 25 miles west of Baton Rouge, across the river. And Maringouin is a town of about 1,200 people now. It used to be 6,000 when I grew up there.
What was it like growing up in Maringouin? Because I have kinfolk in Maringouin, or in that area across the river, but I've never really known what it was like to live or to grow up in that part of the state, because I'm from Baton Rouge, born and raised.
I grew up in the Jim Crow South. I went to college in '64. That was Freedom Summer, and that was the year that the Civil Rights Law passed. So before then, for 18 years, I had lived under strict Jim Crow. However, the segregation in the way that I grew up was you were living among people. My family was living among people who were white, but the segregation was very distinct. We said hello to them, we saw them, but we didn't interact beyond friendliness. I grew up Catholic, and the Catholic Church was segregated. My school was segregated. My school was about a quarter of a mile from my house, and I walked to school every day in elementary school. And then when I went to high school, it was 7 miles away, and I had to ride the bus. My dad was a school bus driver, and so we rode the bus to high school. We drove past a school that was segregated and exclusive for those who are white. And strict Jim Crow segregation meant we could not set foot on that campus. Now, my father, being a school bus driver, when I tell people my dad drove a school bus, they think, oh, that's what he did. Well, if you're a Black man growing up in Jim Crow South, you did more than one thing in order to take care of your family, unless you wanted to work in situations where you were clearly mistreated. So men like my father became entrepreneurs, and the Black bus drivers had to buy their own school bus. And in order to be able to buy a school bus, you had to have enough money. And we had land, and he also owned a nightclub. And all of the school bus drivers were entrepreneurs, because those were the ones who could afford to buy school buses. Just an example of what it was like to grow up in Maryland in the Jim Crow South. Now, our town had 6,000, but we were kind of a 3-area town. It was Maringouin, Rosedale, and Grove State. Those 3 areas were sort of combined. We all shared the schools together. Not so much the churches. There was a church in Maringouin, and there was a church in Grove State. Now, the first church in that area was built by those who were enslaved. Those enslaved people were my ancestors. They had been brought here from Maryland, from White Marsh Plantation, the plantation that the Jesuits owned, and the enslaved worked the plantation that supported Georgetown University. So I'm a Hoya, because the Hoyas said the slaves belonged to them, so now I'm a Hoya, as a descendant of those that Georgetown said they owned. The sale of 1838 sold the Hawkins, which was my mother's name. And so I ended up being born in Louisiana because my ancestors were sold to Louisiana to enrich Louisiana and enrich the Jesuit provinces, including Georgetown University. The Hawkins were Catholic because the Jesuits insisted on their enslaved people becoming Catholic. They built the first church. Now, when they were sold, they were told that, well, the owners were told that they were to be able to practice their religion and that all families would stay together. So they didn't honor that. There was no church for them to attend. And all the families didn't stay together. They didn't keep all the families together, but largely they did. So I know the Hawkins all the way back to 1773, before this was a country. I can tell you my Hawkins ancestors. Not having a church, my great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Hawkins, he would hold mass at his house. Yes, they did live in homes. A lot of people think they didn't have homes, but they did. And particularly, they were not on the ground, because they see a lot of the plantations from the areas that had water. I mean, that didn't have water, so they may have had dirt floors, but those in Louisiana did have floors in their homes. They looked somewhat like the Acadian-style houses. So that's where he lived, and the mass were held at his house. He married my great-great-grandmother in what they call common law, because there was no one to marry him. But as soon as they did get a priest eventually in that area, they built a church. The first church built in Marion, a Catholic church, were those who were enslaved, the Hills, the Harrises, and the Hawkins. And so then that's when they married. When they were able to marry, they did. Before that, they couldn't. Eventually, it is my best understanding that they sold that church and the property, and it's against the doctrine to sell church property, but it was able to be done because, as you know, the message from Reconstruction and Jim Crow slavery was that Black man had no rights to which white man was to respect. The Catholic Church was as white as any other institution at the time. So growing up there, one of the things that I was very aware of is that our parents were always open and honest with us about the racial arrangement. And they always added something that I hear most parents today still don't quite do, that I recommend that they do, and that is say to their children that it is wrong. So if they had to tell us that there was something that was part of this racial arrangement setup, they would say, but it isn't right. And that there is a founding document that is supposed to apply to all citizens. We are citizens, and those rights belong to us. So I always had that message with any racial arrangement message that I was told. It was always added that this hierarchy of whiteness is not right. It's not constitutionally valid. Now, growing up there with the people that I knew, with the way there were six of us growing up. My youngest sister was born when I went to college, and so with the nightclub, my dad opened his nightclub at the height of the blues era in 1951, and he ran it until 1964. Well, actually more like 1960, because the rise in civil rights movement also had along with it that the Jim Crow South was fighting anything that they didn't approve of, that Black people were bringing into the society. And one of the things they didn't approve of was blues. They did not want their young white kids listening to blues. They said the lyrics were too vivid and too sexual. That's when American Bandstand started, and the radio station were moving away from blues and that sort of thing. So my dad saw his business declining somewhat, and he decided to join the movement rather than still try to survive in what a system was empowered to help end in his life. In fact, the blues people whose music he was playing, their music was not being sold widely, and they eventually found a home in Europe, and where they loved them over there because they didn't know that they weren't supposed to listen to it. No one had told them they shouldn't listen to them. So the young white people like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles started listening to this music, and that's what shaped their music. When they came back to the country, when they were invited back to this country, what they call the British invasion was no invasion. The American youth loved this music so much until the producers of music, which were mostly Jewish, brought those British people over, and then they got the high rating of appearing on Ed Sullivan's show, and so they called it the British invasion, but the American people went to Europe and brought them here, and the youth wanted them here. And then when the youth asked them, where did you get this music? They said, from your American bluesmen. They said, well, we thought they were dead. Well, we did too, because we didn't know what had happened. And so then all of those American blues men became popular again because the youth wanted them. And the youth that wanted them were my age group. So by the time I went to college at LSU, the kids were listening to one. I remember I lived in a dorm. I was the first African-American woman to live in women's housing at LSU. And so one of the girls said, would you like to come to my room and hear some music? And I said, sure. And she put on Jimmy Reed. I'm thinking, Jimmy Reed, you know Jimmy Reed? And she said, yeah. I said, how do you know Jimmy Reed? I was told white people didn't listen to blues. She says, we did. We would just sneak away and sit outside the nightclubs in our cars and listen to the music. I had never heard that. I didn't know that story. Now I hear it all the time. So saying that to say, there was a movement going on. There was a civil rights movement. There was the youth movement of saying, you guys have lied to us about this racial arrangement. You've lied to us about what we can do. And you've lied to us about Vietnam, and all of that picked up. But back to living in Maringouin, when I tell people the story of what the racial arrangements look like, they look at us like, well, how'd y'all have a good time? Well, cultures develop in a survival way. And very often anyone who would drive into a predominantly Black area at that time would say, those people are happy. And that was the story out there. Because we knew how to live our lives and have a good time. In a large family, storytelling was part of the way we lived our lives. We would go to my mother and say, Mother, tell us about old times. She would say, I didn't live in old times. My brother lived in old times. So we would love these stories. We would sit on the floor and she would sit in a chair, and it was 6 of us. We listened to her stories of her era. So we learned a lot about the way they grew up. And we didn't learn that it was hard. We learned it was fun. We learned Uncle Pete and Uncle Eddie and all their fun stories, and Aunt Lizzie, and what those things were like, that she could paddle a boat and things like that. And of course, we learned the same thing too, because we lived on a bayou. Both my parents were born on the bayou. Their parents were on the bayou all the way back to when they first got here in 1838. On my father's side, we lived on a bayou. That all the generations all along, the descendants were on that bayou. And my father's mother, the Hawkins, married a Crump. And the Crumps were the ones who had land. And my great-great-grandfather, General, had told his children that he was buying 100 acres of land, which was bought during Reconstruction, when the Freedmen's Bureau came down and helped Black people buy land. And he was able to acquire 100 acres. And he told his children that the land would belong to them and that they were to keep the land in the family, that if they sold the land at all, you sell it to another Crump. On the contrary side, my grandmother's father, Austin, bought land, and he had nearly 100 acres, and it was swindled from him during the boll weevil infestation. They raised cotton and then later sugarcane. And he mortgaged his property, he thought, to afford until the crops could grow back again. And when he was once able to get back into growing crops, the people who held the mortgage told him that wasn't a mortgage, that was a bill of sale. And so he lost his land. Well, he sued them because he knew that he had been told it was a mortgage. And he won. However, that's not the end of the story. They countersued their word against his, and you know how that came out. So he ended up with 28 acres, stole his land. So you can hear many stories like that from those in the South who know their history. That's very common. But here again, living there, my parents had a way of assuring us of our moral values through our Catholic faith, and they assured us of our constitutional rights through the way our community was set up. My father was very patriotic. He believed in the country. He believed in his state. We bought Louisiana products. We would think, Louisiana products weren't even popular then. My father would want to buy Louisiana products. We were like, I don't see these advertised on TV. Why are we buying these products? But, he wanted to support his state. And as far as like throwing paper on the ground and everything, he would say, this is your city. How do you want it to look? So he showed us that we were not just Black people segregated by Jim Crow. He never spoke of that. He spoke of it as an unjust thing that was happening, but that this town did belong to us because he paid taxes. And one of the things that led me to go to LSU is he often said, you know, it's not right that we pay taxes and that LSU can exclude citizens who are not white from a state university. So when he asked me in the summer when the lawsuit, because LSU didn't open as a result of the civil rights law passing, they opened as a result of a lawsuit filed in the name of Freya Anderson, whose father was a dentist, and Dr. Doopie Anderson filed a lawsuit in his daughter's name, and the suit was announced that summer, and he asked me if I wanted to go to LSU. And I was very exhausted from high school, and I said, yes, but in the fall. So I registered to go to LSU in the fall. I loved LSU. I had a wonderful experience there because I was aware of the limits that I had, and I made it a point to open up to all that LSU offered and take advantage of as much of it as I could. And I just think that was just natural to me because in the town that I lived, I had come to see the worth that my parents had for us and how they tried to provide the best they could for us and help us to see the worth in ourselves. And so when I went to LSU, I saw myself as worthy to be there as any student. So I moved around a lot freer, probably because I never worried about whether they had barriers. I would run into the barrier and say, oh, there's a barrier. And sometimes I'd run into the barrier, I didn't even know it was a barrier. And sometimes I would run straight through it because I didn't know it was a barrier. Not all the barriers, because after 64, you couldn't put up signs. So you had to kind of recognize the limits or not recognize them. For example, when I got jobs on campus, they were always where no one could see me. And I used to think, I want a job in a union. But they weren't available, they would say. So I'd end up being working in the back of the cafeteria in an office that was in the back of the stacks. But I didn't know that was because that was part of a racial barrier. So that's what I mean when I say you run into barriers you don't see. But still, I want to say that growing up as a teenager, I mean, I loved television. And even though almost all the programs were white on television, sometimes Ed Sullivan would have some Black people on, and we were so excited about that. And I remember when my dad ran his nightclub, and I know I'm moving around in timeline, but that's how we tell stories in my family. So anybody who thinks they're going to follow this linear is missing the point with me. So when my dad had his nightclub, he had a unique nightclub because his nightclub was on a road that was gravel because the pavement in the Jim Crow South stopped at the city limits. We lived in the town, so we had pavement, but I wish I knew how our grandpa Simon got land in the mainstream of America. I never knew that story, but he had a barbershop there. And then we turned the barbershop into our house until we built a new house, which we were able to build the first 7 years of my dad's club opening because you could make a lot of money in nightclub then because blues was flourishing. And I loved that nightclub. It was beautiful. It was well built. I mean, it looked great inside. He had all wooden chairs and tables, and he had a slot machine, although it was illegal, but I can tell it now. He owned his own jukebox. He bought his own records. I remember going with him to shop for the records. He would listen to the Black radio station, which was WXOK AM. It was the only Black radio station. It was actually the #1 radio station, but no one advertised it as #1 because the advertisers spent their money mostly at the predominantly white radio stations. But as far as the ratings, the Black station was #1. And it wasn't just #1 because Black people listened to it. I found out later that white people were listening to it too. But nonetheless, my dad would listen to that station and know what records to buy. And I told you it was on a gravel road. Well, on both sides of the gravel road were ditches, and on the side of the ditches were foliage all the way. So if you were going to come to the club, and you were going to come from out of town, and my dad banked on that some people from the surrounding areas would come, he put a spotlight outside of his club, and he put his speaker on the outside of his club so you could hear his music playing from a mile away. So you could hear the music before you got there, and when you got closer, you could see the light, and it would guide you right there. So that was just really, a cool, innovative thing. He was probably the first bar to have a TV in the bar, because people would come and watch. They used to have the Wednesday night fight and the Friday night fight. So he was quite an entrepreneur, and I think very creative. And that was the popularity of his place, that people, and he would open early, and he would always set his cooler to make the drinks extra cold because it was hot, and people didn't have air conditioning then at all. And he would open early so they could come and buy ice cold Coca-Cola. And when he would open the bottle, it would the freeze would be icicles at the top of the bottle when if you bought a Coke like that. And the bottles were 6 ounces because people didn't drink 16-ounce drinks in those days. And they didn't drink diet drinks. So, and the beer cans you had to open with an opener. They didn't have the snap top cans. So, I mean, it all sounds great to me because I enjoyed every bit of it. I loved the smell of the place. I never got to go there as a grown-up because I was 14 when he closed the place, just going into high school. But it was a really cool place. And so then when I remember asking him why we couldn't go to the city Labor Day fair. They gave a Labor Day fair every year, but it was white people who gave it. But the ad for it was a banner across Main Street. And of course, I asked, why can't we go? And I now remember looking back, I can see the pain in the back of my dad's head of thinking, how do I tell my children you can't go? So shortly after that question, he started to gather some people in the town to open a recreation center for the Black kids in that town. And it turned out to be great for me because now I could go to dances because we used to have dances there. And my cousins played music and they were great, Little Pony and the Rockettes. And we would go to the dance and my dad was chaperone and my cousin played. I was in heaven because they weren't going to let me go to certain places. But I loved that place. And he did that for his children and it mattered to our lives. So anyway, that's what it was like growing up in Maryland, just partially. You know, I could go on.
That response was something I can't complain about because you basically I'm serious, like you wove in so many different narratives and so many different stories. I hear the story of Black people in the South. I hear the story of Black people in Louisiana, in South Louisiana specifically. I hear your own personal story. I hear all these different narratives woven in, you know, with regards to knowing your history. I don't know where I come from. So the fact that you're able to say, hey, my ancestors were enslaved people from Maryland who came to Louisiana, who were connected to Georgetown, which is one of the most prestigious schools in the world, but has this ugly history of being created and built by slave labor. You know, having those histories and those narratives, I don't care if it's not chronological because life isn't linear. Life just happens. And so hearing all these different stories of resilience and survival and joy and empowerment, that is empowering for me to hear. That actually is a good segue into another question I wanted to ask you, because you have a career as being a news anchor and being a journalist, which also involves telling stories and hearing stories and sharing stories. But I wanted to know, what were your experiences like being a Black female journalist, radio personality, and anchor? And what were some memorable experiences that you have connected to that career?
Wonderful, with some trauma thrown in, because the first trauma was I was asked to, I lived with a roommate who dated one of the DJs at the WXOK radio station. And his brother was the program director. And so I knew them. And one day I was outside washing my car with my pants legs rolled up. And I was hoarse because I had been out the night before in a smoking nightclub. I was 27 years old. And so he stopped and said, would you come and do a promo for me at the station? And I said, okay, but I'm kind of hoarse. He said, well, let's just try it. So I did it. I just had to just say one line. And the general manager heard it and he said, who was that? And he told him and he said, well, hire her. And he called me up and he said, they want to hire you. And I said, me? I don't know anything about radio. He says, you know, and I protested and he didn't talk very much. And I said, and I noticed he wasn't talking very much. I said, do you think I can do that job? He said, I know you can. And I'm thinking, well, I better go down there and at least talk to him. And so as I was talking to the man, I was hearing all about it. I'm thinking, I still don't know. And he says, well, if you don't want the job, we'll start looking for people. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I got the job. And if I don't take it, now they're going to look for people. I'm not even in the running. Oh, I'm taking the job. I'll take it. so, so, so the program director, his name was Dennis Lee. I credit him for getting me into broadcasting, especially with that line, "I know you can." And he said, "Okay." He said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll train you." So I came in to be trained, and he set me up and showed me where the pots were. At that time, you had to manually operate all the knobs and watch the meter for voice levels and things like that. So he showed me all of that, and he put the first record on and told me what to say, and then he walked out. And he says, I'll be right down the hall. I'll be right back." He never came back. When the record ended, I was like, Dennis! That's the trauma. He never came back the whole show. I had to wing it. And I'm just thinking to myself, he threw me in deep water, and I did swim, but God, how traumatic. And never had heard, and I told the general manager, I said, I've never heard a woman DJ before. How does a woman DJ sound on the radio? He said, just don't sound like a man. And I'm thinking, okay, I got this then. So I did that part-time for about 9 months, maybe a year. Then another radio station called me. There was an all-white radio station. And I said, no, because I had another full-time job at a chemical plant. And at the chemical plant where I broke a barrier that I told you about. And that was, I had come out of LSU where the students in my first year there, the handbook said all women had to wear dresses to class. And you can only wear pants to go to the game room, and you have to make sure you're going straight to the game room. And we were sitting around the dorm one night, all white girls and me, and they're saying, well, some Latinos, but they had two, and some Asians. So they said, well, what are they going to do if we just all show up in pants? They can't throw all of us out. So they called around to all the dorms and got the girls to agree that they would show up in pants the next day. I'm showing up in pants. I'm thinking, I just got here the first black, and I'm going to get thrown out of college for wearing pants, but I'm doing it. They didn't throw us out, of course, but that was the last day women could not wear pants at LSU. When you talk about barrier breaking, that was another barrier I was a part of breaking. So now I go to work at a chemical plant, and they say, women have to wear dresses. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. We just did this on campus, and we got to go back into this not wearing dresses. So I went into my boss and I said, look, my office is in the back of the plant. And I said, these plants just have structures, no trees, no buildings to break the barrier, and the road is high. I'm walking in the back. We were wearing dresses short in those days. I said, and the guys all have on slacks, but I'm cold. And he said, I don't care what you wear, Maxine. Next day I showed up in pants, and the women stormed the general manager's office and said, why does she get to wear pants? And he said, well, listen, y'all can wear pants, but make sure you wear a jacket that covers below your hips. And I'm thinking, I am not going to be told where my clothes are supposed to be fit by any man. My dad never told me how to fit in my clothes. He never made a comment. I remember in college, my mother picked up one of my miniskirts and said, Manuel, what do you think this is, a handkerchief? And Dad said, yeah, it must be. And that's the only thing he ever said about the way I dress. I could dress any way I wanted to. And so nobody was going to tell me about my body. So I never wore a jacket. The women stopped protesting. They wore their jacket, but I never wore a jacket. So anyway, so the radio station that was white hired me, and I did not go for a while, but eventually I didn't feel like I was fit into the clerical world very well. And so they offered me more time and more hours. I was only working the weekend on the other station. I was doing jazz. So they offered me more hours, and I took the job, even though it was a cut and pay a little bit, but I liked it. And 9 months after being there, Channel 9 called me to hire. They wanted a black female. The thing they used to do back in the 70s, killing the two birds in one shot. Yeah, everybody knows about it. And they sent one of the black photographers to talk to me, and he had recommended that they call me because they asked him if he knew anybody, and he knew me because he dated a friend of mine. We had networks too. So I interviewed with them, and I didn't want the job. I said, no, it sounds hard. I like what I'm doing. So I talked to the DJs where I work, and they say, well, women kind of age out of radio. You got to think about that. But they have a little longevity in TV. And I thought, well, I thought about that. And then the other guy told me, look, you know, it's not that hard. And I said, but I don't know how to write. And so when I told that to the news director, he said, we'll train you. I get there, they do not train me at all. They don't even put me on the air right away. So I go into his office and I said, I get the impression that someone doesn't want me on the air here. And his eyes got big. And I said, might you tell me what's going on here? Why is that? And he's like, well, I don't know. So he sends me out to the assignment editor. And the assignment editor is looking shocked. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about, boss. So it was only years later that I found out he was the one keeping me off the air. And he thought that I figured it out. I had not. It was totally an innocent question. So eventually they started giving me a few assignments here and there until eventually one of the anchors who did not want to meet with the consultant would come in and help people to polish their work on TV. So I said, can I take his spot? And they said, sure, why not? They figured, what could it hurt? It was kind of like that, you know. So this consultant was really, really great. And she's the one who gave me the path to knowing how to write. So she said, bring one of your reports in and let me see it. So I showed it to her and she said, now tell me that story. So when I told her, she said, I like it better the way you told it than the way you wrote it. And she said, why didn't you write it like that? She said, I said, they would never accept that. She says, have you tried? I said, no. She said, you'd be surprised what you can get away with if you just write the way you want to write. Just write it the way you want and see how far you can expand. I did that and I was a reporter from then. So the biggest challenge I had as a reporter there was there would be stories that they would cover that I would think that's a biased story. And in our meetings, I would bring it up. And they would be so stressed over it, and I didn't know what the stress was. I thought TV station was fair and balanced as they know, as they used to advertise themselves as being at one time. You've noticed they don't do that anymore because none of them are really fair and balanced. They have a perspective, nothing wrong with that, but it's wrong to call it fair and balanced if it's not. And so eventually they stopped having news meetings. So I was the troublemaker in the news meetings. So eventually they hired another Black reporter. And when I would challenge those things, they would say, well, she doesn't have a problem with it. And I thought to myself, you are not going to divide me. So what I said to them was, I wonder what your viewers will think of how this story is covered. Then they started listening to me. So there were challenges, many. I asked questions about the way some stories about women were being covered. I asked about stories the way people who were older were being covered. And all of those things eventually did play out, they did mitigate some of those things. But I wondered why more people didn't challenge. And I noticed that many of the reporters did challenge, but they didn't challenge bigger narratives like that. But they, reporters definitely speak up and they fight, for their story. But I was challenging these bigger narratives. And that's what has led me to do what I do now, because the YWCA needed a board member, and they came to me and invited me to be on the board. And I said, I've never been on a board before. I've never been in any level of leadership like that. And one woman said something to me. She said, you will learn more than you could get in college if you join this board. And I thought, that's intriguing. And she said, what is your definition of racism? And I gave her the definition of prejudice. And she said, well, actually, that's not what racism is. And she told me, and I'm thinking, okay, now I'm back to what my dad told me. I'm clear, it's institutional, systemic. So I became interested, joined the board, got on the board, found out that was not the strong language they used on the board. They were very careful and very coded with their language because they didn't want to offend the funders. So eventually I asked enough questions which challenged the status quo until they said, well, that I found out the thing they do is put you in leadership so that hushes your mouth. Wrong. So I got into the role of second vice president. And then when the next president moved on, the first vice president said, well, I don't want the job. So they said, well, it falls to you, Maxine. I said, well, I don't really want the job. I've never been executive. I've never been president of anything. And so they said, I said, I'm going to need training. They said, we don't have any money. So I raised my own money for my training. And then I said, if our mission is the elimination of racism, what are we doing toward that mission? And they said, well, we have all of these programs for youth and inner city. And I said, what are we, a poverty agent? I said, where's the empowerment? I said, our mission is the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women, helping women to survive the status quo. Where's the empowerment? Well, they were really upset when they said, well, our funders would be offended. I said, maybe if we assured our funders that we were going to live out our mission, we might get funders who support that mission. They were afraid. So then I went, again, raised the money for my training on racial justice. And I got trained. And I said, we need a dialogue on race. They said, well, we have one. So they had a dialogue on race that they started in 1968 when the National YWCA insisted that they desegregate their organization. One organization was called YWCA, and the Black organization was called the Maggie Ringgold organization. It wasn't even called the YWCA. And so they insisted that they desegregate. So those women put together a dialogue conversation with each other to get to know each other. And so I told them, I said, and I asked how they work. That's what they told me. I said, well, listen, that isn't what I'm talking about now. I said, we already do know each other now. We already do work together and go to school together and things like that. I said, so that's not the kind of dialogue I'm talking about. I'm talking about a dialogue on institutional racism. They would say, well, don't mess with those women. They're already they're friends. They get along. They go to each other's houses. And I'm thinking to myself, what are we in Jim Crow South here? And so I didn't say that to them. I just thinking that in my head. And so they really pushed back on the idea of a dialogue on race, on institutional racism, because it would offend the funders. So I decided that I would just wait until my term was up, and I ended up serving 3 terms. So when my term was up, I got with some of the past presidents and started developing this process. But they lost an interest in it after a while because it was too painful for them, because they remember the challenge of desegregating the 2 organizations. And because of that, they did not want any more pain, because all they could see coming from this is pain, and I understood that. So then I started going out in the community and collecting people who had been part of the civil rights movement in Baton Rouge, and people who were in sociology, professors at Southern and at LSU, and history professors as well, to help me in shaping this dialogue. And a lot of people came along over time until we eventually had a Dialogue on Race series. And that series, we did small bits here and there in the late 90s until in 1994, I said the late 90s, but the early 90s. In 1994, the town meeting committee wanted to have a town meeting on race. And so I had the privilege of naming the town meeting, because the person who was the liaison from the mayor's office to the town meeting told them about my work in developing this dialogue. And we were friends, and she had worked with me in TV as well. And so she said, maybe we need to bring me in on how to shape this conversation. So I told her, I have had enough pain over this. I do not want to come into a committee of 20 people who are going to give me another pushback. And so I didn't come in. And so here again, she came back. She said, you've got to. She said, do you really want to see this go as wrong as they're about to do it? And I said, okay, I'll come. So sure enough, I got the pushback greater than I thought. Black and white people were pushing back because they were so afraid. But she was a good facilitator of the conversations that we had, and she was able to navigate what I was saying with what they were saying until we merged into something clear that they could follow. But I mean, before that happened, there would be such hate and vitriol directed toward me. I realized my strength then, because I realized even though it didn't feel comfortable, it didn't scare me and it didn't stop me. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it straight up with integrity and allow them to feel what they feel. Because I eventually saw what really was fear. And I'm thinking, they don't hate me as much as they're afraid. So that's So we ended up doing it. And the mayor, who was Tom Ed McHugh at the time, was so frightened by the idea that we were doing this. 600 people showed up. He had plainclothes detectives posted all over the place because he was afraid that talking about race that openly would create some sort of disruption. Nothing happened except one thing. The video that I had been hired to create to set up the conversation disappeared that night. Never saw it again. No one knows. I didn't think that was accidental, but nonetheless, the people had to answer questions, which was my friend's idea of getting them to give an assessment of the town meeting. And many of them, like 60%, said, we want to keep talking. So then our dialogue started to pick up a little more. And then in 2000, now this was 94, by 2000, my friend, who worked for the mayor's office at the time, her name is Jan Bernard, she decided, along with the town meeting committee, that they would have a review of all the town meetings, and that would ask each town meeting group to take their particular topic, join with another organization or business in the community, and spend 1 year working on that area. So we chose the YWCA and asked them if they would house the dialogue for 1 year. And the person at the time who was the program director at YWCA was Roberta Madden. And Roberta Madden never looked back on that 1 year. She ran the program for 9 years, which gave it a lot of footing in the community. And when she retired at the end of 9 years, then the volunteers said, well, let's keep it going. So we did, and we asked the YW to put money into it. And they said, we don't have any money, and no one will put money into a conversation about race. So some of the people decided that they would, and they said, well, let's just form our own organization. It wasn't me who said it. And they said that Maxine will be our executive director. I said, nobody's asked me. I've never been executive director of anything. Is this the way my life continues to go? Break new ground, Maxine. Teach you nothing. Figure it out. And that's what I have done over and over. Figured it out. So from 2012, when we were established, until 2016, it was, it was small, trickling in here and there. They were going well, but they weren't big. And then in 2016, when Alton Sterling was killed, they started to explode. And then again, when the floods happened, there was a lot of discoveries of discrimination during the flooding, and they picked up again. And then there was and then in November, when the election happened, they burst forward again at the election of President Trump. And from there, they continued to grow until the COVID came, and then we had to stop holding them in person, and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do. And then the police officers kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and almost 9 minutes until he lost his breath and died. Then the explosion was unlike anything I've ever seen. Not only were individuals calling us, but businesses were calling us, and they're still calling us. They want to have this conversation. And the thing is, some of the oldest businesses in Baton Rouge are meeting with me, some of the largest businesses, and putting their people through our dialogue series. I'm very excited about that. I think that to think that Louisiana is having this kind of response and that we have developed something that was ready for this conversation has been so fulfilling for me. It just pulls my whole life forward. And it's like everything I've done up to now is playing out in this work that I'm thrilled to be doing. And the volunteers are showing up, and they're just great. Organizations and businesses have been very supportive. They put money into the organization. And then there's one other thing. We found that after COVID, and then that Black people had stopped joining the dialogue room. So we had to ask ourselves, because I tell businesses and organizations, don't look for whether you're racist or not. Wrong direction. Look for how is your institution seeing the results of how they operate playing out racially. If disproportionately you continue to only be able to find white people to hire, or disproportionately you're only serving white clientele, and you say, I'm open to everyone else, then you have to ask yourself, why is that? And if you have influence in areas you influence, what can I influence? And if you see what you can influence, then say, what can I do about that? And you answer that way instead of saying, we're not racist. You know, we treat everybody the same. We're nice to people and our doors are open to anyone. And those are virtues, and they're lost virtues. They're useless. Ask, what can I do? If you really seriously are open to diversity, then actively do it. So we didn't think we were an exception. So I had to ask, why are mostly white people registered for the series? Well, we had to recognize that the economic impact of COVID-19 had disproportionately negatively impacted people of color. And to put the money into signing up for a Dialogue on Race series was something that was not priority on that list when you got to figure out how to feed your family. So we decided to raise money for scholarships. And as soon as we opened the scholarship registration, 20 people signed up within 2 hours, all of color. So it seems like we had discovered racism in the Dialogue on Race Louisiana organization, because we don't think racism is something you intentionally did. It's often unintentional, unconscious, and indirect. But the discovery of it happening, if we had not paid attention to it, then we would have been having this continually disproportionate negative outcome for people of color, which is what racism is, how it shows up today.
And I'm also thinking about the fact that for a lot of people of color, they automatically assume that, well, I'm Black, I don't need to know about racism, I've lived it. But what I often find in my own work is that people conflate prejudice with racism. So in other words, well, Black people can be racist towards other Black people or towards white people. I'm like, no, they can't. No, they can't. Sorry. But just having that knowledge of racism in a systemic way is something that even we as Black people kind of take for granted. Like, interpersonal and institutional are two different things. And if once you understand the differences between those two things, and you can understand how you can, even if you're around Black people and your upbringing is mostly around people of color, you can still experience racism or still be subjected to systemic racism because you have to navigate systems outside of your home just to survive. And I
What
think
you
that's
say is powerful, because very often we're navigating racism, and but because it has become normalized and people are used to navigating it, then that's not what they call racism. They call racism somebody called you a name, or somebody didn't hire you and they directly told you that, you know, or didn't sell you a house in a neighborhood. But if you're having to be on guard, if you're having to have the talk with your children, the talk about how to manage themselves around a police officer, then you're experiencing racism, because you're preparing them for navigating their lives among those whose job it is to protect communities, protect and serve. But now we're hearing law and order more than protect and serve. But their job, supposedly, is to protect the community. Now you have to tell your children how to protect themselves from those whose job it is to protect the community. That's a racism experience that people are having. And granted, you can say, well, nobody told them to do that, but let's ask, did anybody tell the person who called the police officer and said, there's a suspicious looking Black man, why was that color identified? That's a racism practice. So very often, many of the things we do isn't direct racism. It isn't even intentional, but it's perpetuating racism. We constantly call police officers and give the name, the color of the person with no requests made by the dispatcher. And it is perpetuating racism to tell your children that they're going to have to navigate themselves this way in dealing with the police because they want them to come home alive, without adding, but it's wrong, it shouldn't be that way. And as a citizen, I'm going to do all I can to help be a part of this change. If it's no more than me being a part of the narrative of telling you that this isn't right, or putting you in books and in clubs where you can learn about this systemic setup so you can be a part of the change. So I think what we have to be more aware of is recognizing when we see racism, and also educating ourselves to know the power of we the people, what that citizenship really means. it means more than voting, but it definitely means voting is definitely a power. But there's a way, I think that we tell children, vote because people died so you could get the right to vote. That's what Black kids are told. I say, tell them it's a power. And it's something that once you didn't have, and now you have a power in your hand, use it. I think kids would be more interested in a power than people who died for them, because they think people die. Kids just, they just don't.
Right.
That doesn't weigh on their mind. If they knew an uncle that died in the civil rights movement or something, it would be different. But they're so far removed from that now. But to tell them it's a power in their hands, that not to vote is a vote. And so how are you going to use your power? You're going to use your power to not vote so that you can let whoever puts someone in position that you didn't directly say to, but because you didn't vote, you didn't say, so therefore that was your vote. When they understand those things, it makes a difference to them. And so I think that part of what we can do is change the narrative, participate in having a narrative that is more in line with who we say we are, that we the people means that government of the people, by the people, for the people, that it lives, and that the right to pursue happiness is a citizen right in this country, and that there should be no barriers to color existing in this system, and that there should be an assurance that's given, that is a commitment of this government to ensure that no one ever faces a barrier in this country, their only country, because of their color. The immigrants who no longer have to think about going back to their country. Those who were formerly enslaved are often told, go back to where you came from. Africans did not come here, stolen and brought here and then sold within the borders does not mean that you come from. Having hundreds of years of enslavement means that those Americans who are Black now have no country to go back to. And the country would not know us, and we would not know the country. We know that's the original root of the Blackness in this country, but we don't know our country. I know my great grandfather to the fifth power back to 1773, but I don't know when, where he exactly came from. I don't know which area he actually came from in Africa. So, and immigrants do, and yet they're not told to go back to their country. Changing the narrative would go a long way to solving racism.
I definitely agree with that. And what you said was a word and a half. So I just really appreciated that. I have a couple more questions I wanted to ask you relevant to dialogue on race, and also just some wrap-up questions as well. So I love talking to people of the baby boomer generation, because one of the similarities between boomers and millennials is that we both grew up in a generation where we were in constant unrest. Gen X doesn't relate to that as much, but baby boomers grew up with the civil rights movement, women's rights, all these different movements taking place. And millennials also grew up with this as well. But one of the differences is that for millennials, we grew up in a more globalized world. So we are more connected to the world because of the internet, because of social media. And even when I was going to school, at elementary school, I went to an all-Black school. I understood racism systemically because I went to an all-Black school, and I was raised in a mostly Black setting. But in middle and high school and college, I started going to school with people who were Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American, Arab American, especially going into college, international folks. And I started to experience racism, not just in the sense of Black and white, but also anti-Blackness from immigrant communities, or the fact that African immigrants often have very different understandings of the African American experience, and that there were so many diasporic connections. And I always think about the fact that the race conversations we often have tend to be kind of binary, where it's focused on Black Americans and white Americans, without realizing that racism, though Black and white relations are like the anchor of structural racism, in this world now it's become more complex, because now you have different cultural, ethnic, and multilingual influences that shape experiencing racism, to where Black people can experience systemic racism even if they're not in an environment of white people. It could be in an environment with Latinx folks or Asian folks. So how does dialogue on race kind of address and navigate that reality of globalization and increased multiculturalism, while also still staying true to the fact that racism at its core in America was built on the exploitation of Black people.
You built that so well. It isn't complex, but it's been made to appear complex. We keep it simple. And directly from the founding, when Africans were first brought to the colonies and enslaved, that whole thread of race has run throughout this system till today. So when you talk about Black and white, no one needs to apologize for that, because it was Black and white set up. As the immigrants came in, as this country went out and recruited immigrants, actually did sales pitches in countries to bring citizens here. And so they had to, they saw that some of them were coming in that didn't have a look that they wanted as their citizenship. So they started then to say, well, this group, no, they're not going to make good citizens. So the Chinese were the group that they're not going to make good citizens. And the Latin Americans. And so that's when they started to rank the other immigrants of color into the system, the hierarchy of human value. So that's not complicated. What is complicated is now that they have not ended this race hierarchy. They have answered it by putting on the census, for example, well, what do you want to check? You want to check African American, you want to check Asian American, you want to check which ethnicity you want instead of your race. So they made these complicated applications, but really people have an ethnicity, but a race construct was made up by America. So to make it simple, everyone get to use the ethnicity they believe is theirs, would simplify and end this whole problem of what are you, and use how people identify themselves. This is a free country. Why are we wearing a label that the country has put on us? That's not complicated. That's simple. Stop labeling people by color in this country. Allow people to say what they say is their ethnicity. And what are we using this race construct for anyway? If we say racism's over, then why are we asking people, what is your race? Because race was made up in this country. No one came in here by a race. They came in by their ethnic heritage. So you see, it's not complicated at all. It has been complicated. And then we're struggling through it, trying to navigate it. I don't try to navigate it. I choose how I want to self-identify. If they give me an application, I decide whether I'm going to check a box or not. If it's for my health, I check a box because of certain things that matters to. I'm in the Black Women's Health Study, so I have to check a box as a Black woman, which that isn't all of who I am, so I didn't check everything that tells them what to study about me. But nonetheless, I wanted to participate in the study, and I did. But basically, race isn't real. And we're in the 21st century, and we're still using race construct. And I said this in a gathering where I was a speaker, and one woman was so mad at me. She was African American, and she says, "If you stop calling me Black, I'll still be Black." And it's like, I'm talking about a label that a country has put on you. Call yourself what you want. I'm saying it's wrong that they should have labeled you in the first place. She was still pretty mad. She didn't quite get it, but I understand that, because once you become angry, it's hard to get unstuck from that. But nonetheless, it's not about how people look. It's about that this country decides what you labeled at your birth. That's not okay.
I believe in the world of yes and, like, two things can exist at the same time. It's like you can recognize that some of the labels that we use to identify ourselves are constructs that carry power and are often created by people who want to take power from one group and give it to another. And also recognize that some labels have come with a story and a culture and a history, and you may want to embrace that label. But what I'm hearing is that whatever label you assign yourself, it should be something you assign yourself, not someone that someone assigns to you. And I don't really see the issue with that.
Yes, not in this country. We should not have to assign a label to a person called race. That isn't accurate. And why do we assign that to them? And it isn't that some people want to take power away. It's a construct that's been set up that has never been dismantled. It's been made illegal by the civil rights law, but it has never been dismantled. So institutions can, if they wish, continue to practice the hierarchy of focusing their primary image as a white business, because there's nothing that has ever been called for in the dismantling of these structures institutionally. Telling someone that it's illegal leaves it up to them, in a sense. Unless someone feels discriminated against by their company, then they can hire a lawyer, file a lawsuit, and win some money. Still, nothing tells that company to change their practice. That's simple. That's not complicated. It's complicated because we try to navigate it as if it's real. It's made up, and we're still doing it. And what the thing about the protests, and the key thing is, there are Gen Z people who are in the midst of a movement right now. Gen X's were not, millennials were, but Gen Zs are in the biggest movement since the Civil Rights Movement. And they are in that line, along with the millennials, calling for systemic change, not just policing reform, but systemic change. That's the voice. What's overlaying that is the media has been co-opted into talking peaceful protest, which, how is that the story? What they're calling for is way more powerful than whether the protest is peaceful or not. In the founding of this country to become a country, a nation free from the oppressive regime of the British rule, when the oppression got so far that Britain was so disrespectful of the colonial settlers that it sent a tea company to sell tea to the colonies without having to pay taxes. Yet they had to pay taxes, and they had a tea company. And so they said, no, you are not going to come in here, that tea company is not going to come in here and sell tea to the colonists when we have a tea company. And that tea company has to pay taxes, and this one doesn't? No. That was the knee on the neck moment. They said, before you sell this tea, we'll dump it in the harbor. And they did, and there was rioting, shooting, and looting that led to war. Eventually, the powers that be joined that movement and tried to get the British Crown to give the necessary representation. And when they wouldn't do it, they just called them traitors. Then the powers that be said, well, let's become our own independent nation. When you learn about the Tea Party, you don't learn about the rioting, shooting, and looting, because that did happen, but the focus was what they were calling for. In the movement we have now, they're describing the style of the movement rather than what they're calling for. They're calling for police reform, but mostly they're calling for systemic change nationwide.
And since we are on that topic, I mean, racism and the structure of race is something that is often seen as an American thing. But what really pleasantly surprised me was seeing the international protests kind of happen over the summer in places like Paris, Amsterdam, Nairobi, Sydney, Tokyo, places in which Black people are far less numerous compared to, America. I mean, there were cities that had protests in support of the Black Lives Matter movement where there were more people in those cities protesting, in like Berlin or in Switzerland than they were in some American cities. Being someone who has had to experience, Jim Crow, racial segregation, breaking barriers, creating an organization and a movement on expanding our understandings of race, not just in a professional setting in regards to media, but also just that being the main focus of your work. How did you feel seeing the international groundswelling of support for systemic change when it comes to racism, and just the systemic support and large support with the Black Lives Matter movement?
I was thrilled because they're starting to recognize oppressions that are practiced in their country as well. And they are also recognizing how wrong this country is set up that leaves these barriers in place. Now, when you say Jim Crow, that was a legal system. Slavery was a legal system. So we're not talking about people who did this action. But when you put things down as law, that's what this country has that's different than other countries. They practice these behaviors. Many of them learned it from the United States. But the practice of it is not the same thing as entrenching it as laws that were sanctioned and kept in place by the US Supreme Court. That's why we can say this system is particularly American, because it is specific to America. And yet people love to come in dialogue and say, well, you know, they have racism all over the world. Yes, but not as a structure with laws and policies and practices that have been put in place that have not been removed. Measures have been put in place to mitigate it, but the actual setup has never been dismantled. That's why we still have it.
I think the closest I could think of would be South Africa with apartheid, but that is the closest I can think. No other country has had the kind of racial trauma and violence that we have had from the very beginning of our settlement to now.
Legally set up. Legally set up. Yeah. Unjust, but legal.
And just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's just.
Well, that's what the civil rights movement was about. Mm-hmm. Civil rights movement said it is not legal that those who built this country must be left out as citizens. They were left out when the Declaration of Independence was signed. They had to decide about the slave question. They decided, leave them out, leave them enslaved. When the Constitution was written, leave them out. Only their labor and the indigenous people's land are included. Then they thought, oh, we can include them this way. We can count them so that those who own them get more representative power in the House of Representatives. So they were never included. So some people today who are Black still say, well, we were counted as 3/5. No, that's not true. The group was counted and fully, and the 3/5 was what additional power was given to the owners. Those who were enslaved were not counted as part of citizenship at all. Now, we are now citizens, so the 3/5 does not apply because none of us are enslaved and none of us are left out because we're citizens. But Jim Crow blocked our citizenship, and that has never been dismantled. It's been told it's illegal, but it lasted 100 years and it's pretty entrenched right now. So no other country has an entrenched legal system that was set up to leave its citizens of color out. They were able to practice it without the laws, but we set it in place because of laws. And the main horror of why when you talk about race and you talk about African Americans and you don't include all the other colors, African Americans are the only ones who are not immigrants, and African Americans were the only ones who were described as not quite human. And that's a particular setup. And if you're going to end racism and you focus on those who are descendants of slaves, you will end racism for all. So I'm not so worried about whether or not we make sure that we equalize and call every other color out, because if you end racism, you end it for all. But the focus needs to be on what got done to those who were enslaved and how labeling them as less than human has continued to marginalize the image of a Black man and woman throughout to this day, no matter who you are, judge or janitor. You're all just Black men. You show up in your sweats and your hoodie.
Yes.
Too often it's like that. You know, anytime that you have communities that have what they call listserv, that's constantly sending around emails to each other. I've seen a suspicious looking Black man in our neighborhood. What kind of country do we live in when it's a question that this man is walking in your neighborhood? What? How is it that nobody lives there looks like this man? Is that the problem? And how were you able to have a community that is set up with largely white citizens? How can you do that in this country? Accidentally? It's not an accident. Where people live is not accidental. There are the remnants of the continual marginalized real estate setup that was racialized during Jim Crow. These patterns are continuing today. So we're still operating with racism. It's not about whether people like you or not. Some of the nicest people in the world, no matter how nice they are to you, you could still be marginalized at the bank. And not because the bank doesn't like you, but they're saying, yeah, if I sell you a house in this area, then they'll all come down on my neck because they don't want. You see, it's a whole confused operation that happens because we haven't eliminated the structure. But we can do it because this is the most powerful country on the planet. I think still the richest. I don't know if China has the fastest. but we're still a world power. We can do this. We haven't put the political will behind doing it. We haven't gotten people to understand enough of what racism is, so they won't stop pointing fingers at each other and saying, why aren't you people nicer to us? And why aren't you people behaving better in our country? Why are you tearing up our country, your own neighborhood, and that sort of thing? What neighborhood was torn up during the Revolutionary War? And what neighborhood was torn up during the Civil War? There's no one to ask. They were tearing up their own country, and now there's this big deal about why are they burning their own community? We gotta get our narratives clear, and then we won't be asking these questions that get us nowhere. And blaming each other isn't the answer. But what we know is when we change our narrative. If we change our language, we'll be halfway there. And the way to change our language is get to know the truth and the authentic history, which was not taught in K through 12 education. And it needs to be.
I can't say anything else. Just that's all I can say. That was a word and a half. I know yesterday was Sunday, but that was church. And my headphones are swinging all over the place and stuff. Yeah. I do have one more question. And I always ask this question because I feel like whether it's a job interview, and you know this as a former journalist and anchor, sometimes you leave an interview wishing that you expressed more or that the person you said expressed more. So I always ask, you know, what are some final thoughts that you wanted to share, or what is something that you wanted to share that you may not have had a chance to share during the course of this interview that you want to kind of wrap up and close everything out with?
I don't think there was anything significant that I left out there we want to close out with. If there's an overall thought that I would say is that the education around race is so incomplete in this country, and it needs to be in K through 12 education, but taught authentically. And those of us who can't go back and do K through 12 education have an obligation to get some factual information around race. And Dialogue on Race offers a great place to talk it through with. We unpack that narrative. We unpack those flaws. We get clear. You get a language and a way of talking about it that leads to beneficial change. It informs the actions that you take. When you know different, you do different.
I will have to leave it there. I just cannot believe that I have known of you for about 2.5 years, but I haven't actually had a chance to talk to you at all. Like
we
maybe in passing. Out. Yeah, I agree. And it's so crazy that we have never actually had a chance to talk, just us two, not in passing for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, you know, not like saying, hi, how are you? You know, nice to meet you, but actually talk. And now
you've been building your stuff. You've been really built on building your stuff. That's what's been going on with you. And the same with me, but we'll make time.
Yes,
I'd love to visit with you. Yeah.
Absolutely. And also, I also wanted to say before I wrap everything up, my grandmother is a big fan of blues.
Oh, really?
Big fan of blues.
Who does she like?
I know she likes B.B. King.
Of course.
We don't really talk about music as much in terms of blues music.
Well, you tell her to call me. We'll talk about it.
But yes, I will. Have you ever had a chance to go to Teddy's Juke Joint?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
So yeah. So that is like, so yeah, I'm sure you and my grandmother could have some really good conversations about blues because she loves it. And
as soon as COVID lets up, I want to go to a blues club with her.
Yes, absolutely. But see, like those kind of things I would never have known because we never had a chance to talk, and now we did. I believe that things happen for a reason. Well, thank you so much, Miss Maxine, for sharing your insight with me. I think that of all the people I've interviewed, I have been the most excited to interview you because of the fact that you have so much of a story to tell, and you've done so much in this community to change the whole narrative around race and systemic racism, and just to get people who normally would never even think about race to actually think about race. And I think that is an accomplishment that should never be forgotten at all. Yeah, but thank you so much.